Hey, I'm just quickly jumping in here before we get into today's conversation. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Click that little bell button to get notified when the new episodes come out. And if you'd like to support Paramount Importance even further, please check out our website, paramountimportance.com. We've got some awesome merch there. They've got these cool shirts, these cool hats, all environmentally friendly and the highest quality we could go. It generally helps us keep on doing what we are doing, spreading the word of science, inspiring a whole bunch more people. It really helps us out. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Let's go. Paramount Importance. This episode, we are going on a little bit of a journey and talk about a wide range of topics. We're going animals and ecosystems. We've got a special guest today, Professor Nicki Mitchell, who has an illustrious career spanning across countries from different animals. We've got talking about tuataras, which is an animal I've never heard of till I met you.
Yeah.
We've got frogs and turtles, which is just some of the things we're going to speak about today. As we were having a chat just briefly before, you've done so many things and so many interesting things that I don't know, we definitely won't be able to get even just the pinnacle of it in this podcast. But and we're going to speak about different ecosystems and wells. But I want to start with the topic of tuatara.
Yep.
Because, as I mentioned, an animal I've never heard of, and the way you explained it to me when I first met you was just like, what?
Yeah.
So what are they?
So they're a reptile that now only occurs in New Zealand, but they're a hugely significant reptile. So we have 4 groups of reptiles in the world. So we've got the crocodiles, we've got the squamates, which are the lizards and snakes, and then there's the tuatara and the turtles. So the tuatara, so there's like 4 big radiations of reptiles. The tuatara are the only species that survives of their radiation. So they come from a lineage called the Rhynchocephalia, which were the dominant small reptile around the time of the dinosaurs. So these huge reptiles, or becoming into mammals, like the dinosaurs, in the Mesozoic, and at that time, there was also these little reptile scurrying around in the forest, which were Rhynchocephalians. And then the sister lineage, which were the sort of things we think of as skinks and geckos and things, that radiated a bit later than that lineage of reptiles, and they ended up dominating the Rhynchocephalians. So they went extinct. So basically they seem to think they're outcompeted by squamate reptiles. And the only place they survived was New Zealand, because New Zealand sort of broke off Gondwana about 85 million years ago. Tuatara, or that type of reptile, was on New Zealand, and never mammals, terrestrial mammals, never occurred there naturally. So they seem to survive in one location, which is New Zealand. So there's this extremely unusual reptile that's on the only species in its lineage.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Was the dinosaur extinction, that was 66 million years ago?
Oh, yeah, around the time.
Right, around that
KT
time.
Brown,
So
yes.
they
survived. That's right. So they've survived only by budding off from Gondwana, I guess.
Yeah.
As the New Zealand continent formed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
is the New Zealand continent a volcanic island, or is it?
No.
If it's broken off, it can't be. So that's a silly question.
I'm not an expert on biogeography, but yes.
So how big are they, and what do they look like?
They look a bit like an iguana, I suppose, is the closest thing I can think of.
Because that's not a little lizard.
No, so some of them are about, I think the biggest tuatara measured might be almost a bit over 1 metre long. So they're quite substantial, but they vary in size. This population I studied was on an island in Cook Strait called the North Brother Island tuatara. It was actually a separate species at the time I was working on it in 2000. Unfortunately, a bit of genetic work decided it wasn't a separate species anymore, so it's now a sort of subgroup of one species. But that's a bit of a smaller example. But so tuatara is a Maori word for I think spiny back. So they've got these little sort of spines along their back. They've got big brown eyes, and they're they're kind of slow. They're nocturnal. They live for 100 years, and their sort of skulls are quite distinctive. So they were sort of, I think, described in the 1800s as this different lineage of reptiles when someone sort of looked hard at the skull and thought, this doesn't look typical.
Right. What are the defining features of
There's
the skull?
a few, but one of the ones that's sort of the common one that people know of is they've got 2 rows of upper teeth.
Oh,
and the mid
okay.
and the bottom row sort of. We were talking about dentistry before, so there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the base, the lower jaw sort of teeth slot into the gap in the two rows of teeth in the top, and the teeth are sort of fused into the jaw. They've also got sort of a slight beak at the end of their bones, or sort of their snout. So
Okay.
yeah, but if you're not into your reptiles and you saw it, you probably wouldn't think that's a different lineage, but it is.
Yeah.
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 What do they eat if they've got 2 rows of teeth? Are they carnivores, or are they
They're carnivores, yeah. They
Yeah.
eat insects, but famously they spend a lot of time in the burrows of seabirds, things like little penguins and shearwaters and other things that have these extensive populations on offshore islands. That's where tuatara now occur, and they go into the burrows and eat the chicks and they eat the eggs. So they'll eat anything that they can. They don't move very fast. They're not exactly sort of dynamic predators, but if something walks past, they'll lunge and have a go. So yeah, they're carnivores.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they eat other reptiles as well. So the island I worked on was only 4 hectares, but it had 5 species of reptile on it, and I think someone estimated something like 10,000 individuals of different species reptiles were probably on that island. Tuatara, though, we counted everyone. We spent 6 weeks there catching every single one we could find, and we think there are about 450 large, So
That's not many, considering
no,
that's the
and it
whole
was its own species at the time. Yeah, so this was it's a famous. If you're into reptiles, tuatara are kind of one of those iconic things you want to see.
Yeah.
And this was the rarest of the species at the time, so it was a privilege to get to work on it.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So is clearly they would be quite endangered then.
Not anymore, because they've been subsumed into one species, and they occur now on I think about 35 or so offshore islands in New Zealand. So they're not listed as a threatened species. Admittedly, they once were widespread. They occurred on North and South Islands. The big land masses of New Zealand would have had tuatara everywhere before Maori arrived. But Maori arrived with a rat, the kiori, or it's a Polynesian rat that came with them probably accidentally.
So different from the black rat.
Yeah, and then other rodents and things like the mustelids, the frostotes and the weasels and things came in with this sort of naturalisation societies that both Australia and New Zealand had, where they decided that it'd be nice to have some English species on these continents, and they introduced them, and that wiped out tuatara from the mainland. So they've only survived on offshore islands where there's no predators. All the predators are very heavily managed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you'd think that, but they're not conservation dependent in the sense there's a fair number of them. And there's various technical reasons about how you can prove something's going to be threatened with extinction, and they just don't fit those categories at the moment.
Right. Okay.
Although I do think they are threatened with extinction, but it's going to be over a long time frame. And and only in particular spots.
Okay.
Which is what we might talk about.
Well, I'm actually going to jump straight into that, because you
Yeah.
worked in government working to listing threatened species. How does that process go? Like, how does that work?
Okay, that's a different topic entirely, which I did later in my career, but that's listing threatened species is something that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, kind of conceived with something called the Red List. So it's sort of the world's catalogue of things that they think are threatened, and they put them in different categories of threat. So there's things that are definitely extinct, there's things that are extinct in the wild, which might mean they're now only in captivity. And then there's things that are still around, but they're either critically endangered, or vulnerable. They're 3 threat categories. The critically endangered ones are more likely to be extinct sooner than the vulnerable ones, but they're all have some sort of probability of being extinct into the future. And then there's things that don't qualify. So there's 5 different things you look at with each species about whether or not it's going to meet any criteria to fall into a category. And it's things like, has their population trend collapsed over at a particular, like by 90% or 20% or 50% over 3 generations, which is its average sort of time it recruits to the next generation. So you have to, every species has its own time frame that you have to assess its trend. That's specific to its biology. So if you can prove that with confidence, that's one way you can pick a category. Things that have small
How do you go about proving?
You need data. So a lot of species in the world will have not enough information to be sure of these trends. So they're called data deficient, or you might not be able to assess them in every category because you just don't have that knowledge. But that's one of the reasons why there's 5 ways. So if you haven't got the data to say, I haven't got any population trend data, but you say, I actually know this thing only occurs in a very small location, number of locations, and you've also got high confidence that it's going to decline in the future, perhaps something like climate change or a disease that's breaking out, that's another way you can prove it fits into one of those categories. And then you can do simple things like count them. So another way to qualify is if there's fewer than 50 individuals left in the world, you're critically endangered. So it's a technical art that the IUCN have changed the rules a little bit over time, but they're pretty stable, and they do this comprehensively for the world's major well-known groups, particularly the vertebrates, and they do it for some types of plants. But in Australia, we use exactly the same rules to choose our own, or to basically identify our own threatened species. We use exactly the same criteria, and that's what the EPBC Act, the government Australian national legislation, there's a group in there called the Threatened Species Scientific Committee that I used to be a member of, and that committee's job is to evaluate new nominations for threatened species, to do all the scientific work, and then basically that recommendation goes to the National Environment Minister, who formally makes that assessment, and it goes on to a legally listed threatened species. So, and then states also do this as well. So, yeah, some states have different rules, but WA does it the same way that the Commonwealth does, which does it the same way as the world. So that's usually quite handy. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like there's like a lot of processes
to
go through.
Yeah. It's a rigorous, and especially if you're doing it for a national, something that has a legislative impact. Like if you list a threatened species, then it becomes something called a matter of national environmental significance, and that means a developer has to consider their impact on anything that's it's called MNES is the acronym. So the more of these things we're going to be adding a lot of Australia's species to the list. We've got about 2,300 things listed as species at the moment on our national legislation, but the list is going to keep growing just because we're working through a catalogue of things that are genuinely threatened.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Because why is it important though to do that, like to catalogue these species? Because that, I'm assuming, I'm going to probably answer part of the question is because that can stop, say, development or...
Yeah. Globally, doing it as an IUCN thing has no legal power, but it tells us about the state of the world and how things are trending. So if you can comprehensively assess all the world's birds and then do it again 20 years later, you can see how birds are trending. So having this one consistent methodology and doing it for all species is super useful to looking at biodiversity collapse, because we're in a biodiversity crisis as much as we are in a climate crisis with biodiversities. We're losing species at a very high rate, and we're losing the abundance of species as well. But in a national sense, having things listed on our legislation means that they've got some chance of protection, because it's going to be trickier to clear their habitat than if they weren't listed. Sometimes there's funding. So the government sometimes they have a sort of, at the moment they have something called the Threatened Species Action Plan, where 110 of those more than 2,000 species have a dedicated sort of funding package for a decade, where they're sort of trying to put some funding in to see if they can assist recovery. But a lot of the recovery actions really are done by states and their own practices and funding. So if you can't prove that you're in a threatened category, you've not got much hope of getting any funding or having much protection. And if you are known to be threatened and it's a high profile species like a koala, you can get huge amounts of funding, particularly philanthropic and community funding. Like the koala got, I don't know how many millions or billions were raised after the Black Summer bushfires, but it was sort of the iconic species that the world was seeing affected by fire, and so people thought it needed help. So a lot of money flowed in for
well, that's
things.
Actually where we're going with my PhD.
Yeah,
and I'll talk to you about that after. But one of the habitats that we were looking at is for critically endangered species.
Yeah.
And
salamander fish or minnow?
No, not freshwater.
Oh,
and
okay.
It's actually not a fish. It's actually
a crustacean?
No, not a crustacean.
Okay.
It's actually an area of research that you're interested in.
But
I'm going to not say it out in the podcast.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'll definitely speak to you about it after.
Yeah. So we can't really list tuatara because we can't prove that their populations are collapsing, by 90% in 3 generations. Or whatever it is that we might.
Which is crazy, because if they're wiped out from the mainland, which is the biggest landmass.
That happened a long time ago. So if it happened too long ago, you don't.
Oh, so there's a timeline.
Yeah, because you're looking at 3 generations, which is three. So for a tuatara generation is about 30 years. That's the average age of an adult reproductive tuatara. So 3 generations is 90 years. So you have to prove they've collapsed by 90% over 90 years in that case, and they haven't.
Right.
Yeah, but if you looked at over 1,000 years, they would have. But that's not how the rules work.
Interesting. Why would that be?
Why
Why is the cutoff like, say, 3 generations and not?
It's 10 years.
Because humans have been around forever. Well, not forever. Sorry, that sounds.
It's all about the probability of extinction. So if a species with a life history that's a fast breeds every year, if it's collapsed by 90% in 3 generations, which might be 6 years, it's seriously in trouble. It's likely to be. It's critically endangered. That would mean it's got a high probability of being extinct in the foreseeable next couple of decades. So it's things that are long-lived with long generations. Assessing their rate of decline, it's more appropriate to do that over a bigger, longer time frame, because they're not naturally going to vanish in 10 years, because there's always going to be old individuals that hang on. So it'll take them slower to go. They'll be more slow to go extinct than something that breeds fast. It might only have a lifespan of 2 years. So if it's suddenly reproduction's failed, there's just no one else coming on board to recruit. So.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that does make a lot of sense.
It's all context dependent, yeah.
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 Well, I'll
jump
back.
Didn't expect we were going to start there.
No, me either. It wasn't even
I probably didn't do it justice, but it's a bit of a dark art. But
yeah. No, it's very, very interesting. I think that's why we went down a rabbit hole in the opposite direction. I'll jump back into the tuatara. So the tuatara have an unusual biology adapted for New Zealand's cool climate, including taking life in the extreme slow lane. Mm-hmm. Can you explain the tuatara extreme longevity? They exceed 100 years, slow maturation and infrequent reproductive cycle. Females breed every 2 to 5 years or every even 9 years on different islands as well.
That's what I found out. The 9 years was my data.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Yeah, New Zealand's fauna are all pretty long-lived. So even things like some of their frogs, I think they've got the longest-lived frog species in the world, which is at least something 35 years. It's a little species called Archie's frog.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of the cold reptiles that living in cold climates tend to do things pretty slowly, partly because reptiles are ectotherms and run around much more quickly when it's hot, and when it's slow, they're a bit more metabolic rate's low and they don't have as much capacity for feeding and growth. But but let's focus on tuatara. So they're we don't know they're 100. I think they're very likely to be. We've seen animals that were collected in the 1950s that are still around now, and they looked like adults in the 1950s. So they're getting pretty close to being able to prove that they're at least 100, but we actually don't know definitively what their life.
So you can't age them from their skeletons or anything?
There's various people trying genetic methods, and no, they don't have counting 100 growth rings in a bone is probably not going to work. So yeah, you can age a lot of animals through looking at growth rings in bones, but not if they're going to have 100 of them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So your best bet is to mark something when it's young and keep finding it until it's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Which is again what we were partly doing. So probably should start the tuatara work was I started working on climate change. Basically, that was the reason I studied it and came to New Zealand. So I was sort of my husband was doing his PhD over there. I was still finishing a PhD in Adelaide, but wanted to move to New Zealand, and I was looking for a sort of sexy idea to write a grant about. And I was really lucky. The British Royal Society in London had just a fellowship scheme that was going for 5 years called the Banks Electo Fellowship, and that was named after Joseph Banks. And it was basically if you came from a country that Cook and Banks visited on the Endeavour, and you wanted to do some research in another one of those countries, you could apply for this grant. So as an Australian, I could apply to do something in New Zealand because it was what this grant was about. So kind of looked for some interesting idea, and always loved working with reptiles, even though did frogs. I was a frog, and my PhD was on frogs. Yeah, this just seemed, let's pick an iconic species that, the Royal Society might think is an interesting thing to fund. And climate change was sort of, people were talking about it then. And also, they had just discovered that the tuatara have temperature-dependent sex determination. I think it was published in Nature in about 1990. And a lot of reptiles do have that, so no genetic determinant of sex is determined by the incubation temperature, which is a male or a female. But the tuatara result was particularly interesting because males were produced at the highest temperatures. So most reptiles with TSD sorry, that's my acronym for temperature
Yeah,
dependency.
yeah.
Most of them, like the sea turtles, have females produced at high temperatures. And other types of reptiles, like crocodiles, have males in the middle and females at hot and cold extremes. But tuatara are the only, and this is again a paper that I published which sort of proved that the tuatara were the only species in the world with this reverse pattern, with males produced at high temperatures, and that's it. You don't get females again at higher temperatures. So it's females at low temperatures, and then there's a switch to males. So they just discovered that, and they'd also, this North Brother Island population was a PhD student, Nicki Nelson, was working there, and she'd been trying to sort of do mark recapture studies to try and guess what the population size was, and she was sexing every animal she found, and they're quite easy to sex because males are bigger. And there was 60% males on the island rather than wasn't balanced. And so I guess the research group was sort of saying, I wonder if there's some sort of signal of climate change, and wonder what the probability of this population becoming more male is going to be with rapid climate warming. So that was sort of what my postdoc was about. I literally finished my PhD in Adelaide and handed it in on, I think, a Friday, flew to New Zealand the next day, and then 2 days after that, I helicoptered onto this island and started a postdoc.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, it was
no rest, eh?
No rest, but it was partly because I was trying to catch the breeding season. So they
Okay.
they only breed once a year in November, and I was sort of...
And we mentioned earlier, it's like either 3 to 5 years as well. I guess that's, so.
Well, yeah, it was actually every 9 years is what I worked out. So, yeah. So I did a postdoc there funded by this lucky grant that I got. And so my first job was to work out whether this species also had temperature-dependent sex determination. I'm going to say species, but it's actually, as I said, subpopulation now. And it was likely to, but we didn't know what the actual sort of temperature where they transition.
Mm-hmm.
So sea turtles, roughly, it's about 30 degrees where they go from being males to females as the nests get hotter. Tuatara, it was about 21 degrees. They go from
really cold.
Female. Yeah, that's because their nests are colder. So my job was to collect as many eggs as I could from that island and fly them off on a helicopter to the university in Wellington and incubate them there in incubators that the group that I was working with had. And they take a year or more to hatch.
Oh, really?
Yep. And then you don't know what sex they are when they hatch because they all look the same. So then you have to wait about 2 years to do an operation. Like you do surgery, and I wasn't skilled enough to do the surgery. So Nicki, my colleague, who's also got the same name, she had been trained by a vet to do this, so she was allowed to. So you basically just do a little incision in their flanks, and then you put in a laparoscope, and you find the gonad attached to the kidney, and you can see if a testes or an ovary. So that's how I worked out what sex I was getting at the different temperatures.
It's a very long process.
It was in retrospect, it was a very bad idea for a postdoc because if you're trying to sort of establish an academic career, public, it's all about, how rapidly your papers come out. And
Yeah.
my tuatara papers took a while to come out because I had to sort of wait to get these data. But so basically I worked out what the threshold was for that population. And then we started doing demographic work to prove that population was actually male biased, and it was. The previous estimate was done based on subsampling the population, whereas we thought, right, we're here for 6 weeks, we're going to try and catch everything. So I lived there for 6 weeks, and new people came on every week to help fly the helicopter. And it was
Sounds amazing.
It was, and we were tracking all the females that we thought should be nesting. So they're very, very cryptic. They don't like to be watched when they do everything at night in the dark. And you're on this rugged,
but if they're
windswept
quite
island.
slow.
They are, yeah. And so they take about 3 or 4 weeks to dig their hole, and they don't like you to know where it is, so they often abandon it and move off. So we were all trying to keep track of where the females were and whether they'd laid their eggs. And if they did, that's when we would go in the next morning and dig them up, and they'd get flown off to be incubated at a particular temperature. But it turned out to be actually quite hard to get enough eggs that way. So we ended up doing something called induction, where you can bring a female in and you can inject her with oxytocin, a hormone, and she'll lay eggs in a box. So we did that as well. But in order to know which ones we should do that to, you can sort of feel their eggs through their stomach. It's a process called palpation, but you didn't always know because they could just be fat and have had a big meal.
Yeah.
So we actually x-rayed them all. So I actually had to learn how to do x-ray, and this island had no power. So we were living on old lighthouse keepers' cottages. It used to be a manned lighthouse, and they depopulated it sort of 30 years earlier. So there was a little sort of research station there. No power, so I had to take a generator, turn on the generator. I had to wear lead aprons And we set up one of the rooms as the X-ray room. So we put the tuatara females in there with a little, and then I'd take the X-ray. And then the helicopter would come every week. We'd put the X-ray plates on the chopper. They'd go to the hospital in Wellington. And the radiologist I was collaborating with, who taught me how to do this, would give us a call on a mobile phone, which was in 2000, which was even then, it was a pretty early mobile phone. And he'd call in and say, yeah, it's number 76 and number 22. They're the ones with eggs, because you could see the eggs through the X-ray. And then that's how we knew which ones to nab and bring in.
So you couldn't actually see what in front of you?
No, the eggs you could see from the X-ray, but you couldn't. As I said, you could sort of feel them, but you weren't always right. Yeah. So you didn't want to be injecting hormones into a female that didn't have eggs. So that was how we worked out only 13% of the females were laying eggs that year, which is how we worked out on average. They take about 9 years between reproductive events. So this is a really long story. We could do a whole podcast on it, but basically what we think is
happening. Oh, no, keep going, because it is extremely fascinating.
Yeah, so this particular population is becoming males are dominating. It's potentially a signal of a warming climate because those nests are getting a bit warmer and more likely to be hatching out as boys. And the male tuatara have faster growth rates, and they grow to be about twice as big as a female. And they're territorial, and they dominate the food. So the food is limited on a small 4-hectare rock in the middle of the ocean. So if the males are sort of, basically consuming more of that food than females as the population's growing, the females basically started to get skinny. So there were the same animals had been collected by a guy called Richard Barwick, I think his name was, in the 1950s. He'd actually gone out and marked and toe clipped a lot of these animals, which means that little bits of their digits have been trimmed, which is what herpetologists do, to be able to prove it's the same animal through time. So yes, these same animals were being captured 50 years later, and you could see that they'd been in great condition in the 50s. They were in really bad condition in the early 2000s. And it seemed as though the males were likely to be getting most of the food. So females are getting scrawnier. So that means that's one of the reasons why they can't lay eggs very often. So in captivity, we know tuatara can lay annually. I mean, that in nature, more like every 2 or 4 years in most places. But on this island, about every 9 years. So if you add all these things together, we've got what we think is an extinction vortex playing out. So we're getting masculinizing a population because of climate change. And then there's more males, which outcompete females. Females get skinnier, lay fewer eggs. And if you put that into a population model, you can prove it will go extinct.
Yeah.
So we did that sort of modelling, and we think it's going to take a while, but we're pretty confident there's an extinction vortex going on in this particular situation.
Can you, as a scientist, do anything about it?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting questions about intervention. But the other thing I worked on with a bit of fancy modelling, which I learnt from a fantastic collaborator, Mike Carney, we also looked at what females could do about climate change, because they nest on this particular northern warmest slope of the island. But if the climate's going to warm by 2 degrees, they've got options about nesting elsewhere to try and cool things down a bit. So they could go to the south face. They could dig a deeper hole where the eggs will be cooler underground. They could change the time that they nest. So there's sort of 3 different behaviours that reptiles use to adjust, adaptively adjust their temperatures of their nests. So we basically looked at all these scenarios of different behavioural change that they could do if the climate was warmer in the future. And we've sort of proved that there was almost nothing that tuatara could do to make female offspring if the climate warms by about 3.5 degrees, which is what Cook Strait was predicted to warm by 2085. So that's one of the reasons we think there's going to need to be some intervention if this population is to persist. And so we modelled a few scenarios, like you can put shade over nests to cool them down. That's what a lot of sea turtle populations, that sort of things happening.
Penguins here and all those.
Yeah, didn't know that, but that could make sense. Yeah, that's a simple way to do it. But the challenge there is, of course, finding the nest to put the shade over, because as I was just explaining, they're pretty hard to know where they've nested. You could do what I did and harvest the eggs, take them back to an incubator and put them into a temperature that makes the females and then release them back as females. Or you could do something, which is what I guess got me interested in something called assisted colonisation, which is recognising that climate change is a threatening process you cannot mitigate, and you effectively move a species poleward into a climate that's basically their analogue climate of what they've actually adapted to. So we could take North Brother Island tuatara and move them south to a southern part of New Zealand where the climate would effectively allow them to make females again.
But you see
And that's
like
all- yeah.
tropicalisation with fish naturally, I
Yeah.
guess, happening.
Yeah,
But when I guess you're stuck on an island, you don't have
exactly. So
They don't swim?
They can. They've been seen in the ocean by people on boats. Probably they get knocked off in huge storms when they're sort of living on these sort of precipitous islands. But I don't think they mean to swim, but I think they can for a while.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they can disperse through swimming. I doubt it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the ones on islands are kind of left there from the last time that the sort of sea levels.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously got a lot of questions, but there was one about the policy of translocating, because would be quite difficult. Like we come across all these complications all the time. And then I guess the one quick one would be, how long does the temperature have to be for it to change sex? Like what if you get a heat wave a week? Does that change the sex?
Yeah, so that's something I haven't gone into, but the weeds of sex determination are it's a bit technical, but there's effectively a reptile that has TSD is what they call has a bipotential gonad. So it could either go into a male or a female, depending on the cue it experiences as it's inside the egg, as it's developing into a sort of full-blown reptile to hatch.
Okay, so obviously it has to be outside of the animal.
No, it's
in the nest.
So it's in the egg. It's in the egg, and that's developing from a sort of yolk to an actual reptile that's about to hatch. And as it's developing, there's a window of time called the thermosensitive period, and it's that time that the cue matters, and so the gonad sort of starts this sort of primordial gonads in there as the embryo is developing. And then when there's this thermal cue, that's it sort of sends a cascade of hormones that either trigger that gonad to be a testis or an ovary, and it is a particular window of time. So it's usually about halfway through, but it might only be 2 weeks. So you're right. If there was a heat wave in that particular 2-week window when that nest was primed for triggering male or female, that'll be what drives that outcome in that particular nest.
Wow.
Yeah. So knowing where that window is also part of being able to model and predict climate change. So I had to work that out as well with something called a backswitch experiment, which I've also done with sea turtles in WA.
What?
It's called a backswitch experiment.
Okay.
So if you want to know which part of the development is going to be the bit that matters, you do you basically get a lot of eggs, you put them into a temperature that makes males and a temperature that makes females, and you incubate them like that, but you swap incubators. So you move the eggs that would have been in the boy temperature into the girl incubator for, say, 2 weeks, and then you move them back into the boy incubator. And then when they hatch, if they've come out as boys, you know that you didn't hit the thermosensitive period because that time at the other temperature didn't make a difference. But if they come back as girls, you go, it was that week that mattered. So you do a lot of these different types of switch experiments to work out.
I reckon you'd have to do that.
You do, yeah. So we've done
How long do they stay in eggs?
Depends on the species. So a sea turtle, which you've done it with, would be a couple of months as the experiment time. To a tara, it's more like a year, because they take a year or more to hatch. But it depends on the temperature.
So they're sitting in the nest for a year.
They roughly hatch out a year after the nest. Yeah. And the species I started working on in Tasmania, the moss frog, also takes a year. It's a frog. It doesn't have a tadpole, and its egg takes more than a year to hatch as well. It's up in the snow. So I was sort of used to these sorts of weird things that take a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, and you said that. So is the tuatara also 2 week? That 2 week period, or is it like?
No, it's probably a bit longer than 2 weeks. Yeah, I think it's more like a month. Probably matters.
Right.
But even so, to actually really resolve exactly how many days it is something that we probably haven't got enough eggs to prove. But if we know roughly, it's this particular something like 30 to 40% of its time to hatching. That's the bit that
it's extremely fascinating.
Matters. Yeah.
So imagine the amount of work you would have had to do to figure this out would be.
Yeah, it was a series of I'm discussing a whole sort of different numbers of papers that we put together. But overall, we sort of came to the conclusion that.
What's the evolutionary process of this? Why do reptiles do this?
Oh, I thought you'd ask me that question.
Yeah.
That's one of the most ongoing conversations in people who work on TSD is why has this evolved and why does it persist? I don't think we still know. There's various adaptive hypotheses why it might make sense to match a temperature to a sex. So the temperature, there's always an optimal temperature for most things to develop where you come out sort of at your peak performance. You might be most able to sprint when you're hatching, or you might have used the optimum amount of egg yolk to hatch at that temperature. So sometimes it's the sex that benefits most from having higher fitness might be the one that the sex is linked to that particular temperature. It's hard to know.
But that
but
still doesn't matter if it's male or female because it's
So some species benefit. So for tuatara, males are the ones that need to be. They benefit have higher fitness from being at bigger body sizes because they dominate mating. Sea turtles, it's females that benefit from being large because they have really high fecundity, so their fitness, there'll be strong selection on that. So there's sort of some nice stories you can tell about the sex that needs to be bigger is the one that comes out at the temperature that also gives them sort of optimum performance. The other sex is sort of like the less important sex, but it's something that they think, TSD is common to all the basal reptile groups, the crocodiles, the sea turtles, and some of the squamates and the tuatara. So we know it's been a sex determination method through all sorts of climatic change in the past.
So is there like common lizards?
So not all. So a lot of squamates, which are the lizard, geckos, pygopods, dragons.
Too.
Yeah, dragons in particular in Australia, like the frillnet lizard is one. But not some freshwater turtles have it, some don't. It's very sex in reptiles is a really complex process. So some species
right from the contraception part as well sometimes. But
some reptiles can have both genetic sex and temperature dependent sex, and they can switch between them. So there's some fantastic work on bearded dragons being done out of the University of Canberra. So beardies are one of the species that hugely popular in the pet trade. A lot of people all over the world have bearded dragons, but they've got temperature dependent sex determination, but also there's a genetic pathway as well, and they can do sex reversal. So I'm not going to try and talk about that because it's complicated, but
they can.
The main point to remember is that it's not simple in reptiles what sex they're going to be, especially if there's any sort of environmental determinant of that outcome. So
that's crazy. Like I was aware of the turtles.
Yeah.
And tuataras when I started doing this research, but wasn't aware of all these other reptiles as well.
Yeah, it's common.
I probably maybe should have paid more attention.
No, you just got to be into reptiles.
Yeah, fish was always my area. But
fish have a temperature dependent sex determination as well, but not many. But some of them do. And we know fish do weird things like change sex during their lives as well. So,
I knew about that.
Sex is a bit of an abstract thing, really.
Yeah. I had no idea. I've got to find out which ones do that.
Yeah. Well, wrasse and things like that.
And they're the ones that. No, they're the ones that change sex.
Oh, the ones that have environmental sex determination. Yes. I don't, off the top of my head, know the answer, but I know there's a few.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with climate change, everything's getting warmer.
Yep.
If for the sake about sea turtles.
Yeah.
Is it much of a worry then about, I guess, just the reproduction side? Because obviously, how many females can a male court?
Plenty.
So it's not as a bigger issue if it's changing to a male.
Exactly right. Yeah. So sea turtles have generally female biased populations. That seems to be normal. They're getting extremely biased though. So say, for example, in the northern Great Barrier Reef, there's a population on Rain Island, which was the biggest sea turtle rookery for green turtles in that part of the world. And that's the researchers work there are very, very concerned that sex ratios are skewing to the extreme. Almost no males being produced anymore. Obviously, there will be male rarity will become a force that turns the population into a collapse because they can mate with multiple females. That's normal.
Yeah, and then you start getting same genetics.
And generally in conservation, if you have more females, it's a good thing because they're the limiting factor in population growth. If it's not a monogamous breeding system, then you can have a few males, lots of females, and things do quite well.
Yeah.
But that's why tuatara was such a clear case of an extinction vortex because if you've got a few females that are only breeding every 9 years, and I didn't mention they only have about 4 eggs. So, they're not like a sea turtle that could lay a couple of hundred.
Oh, wow, yeah. So reproduction would be really slow. That would be slower than a mammal.
Yeah,
it would be.
An elephant or something,
Yeah.
Wow. Where were we?
I do want to get to policy. I guess.
Okay.
But I just want to keep
policy of
translocation policy. But one more on the TSD. I guess there would be a genetic bottleneck as well then if there's only one or two, very small amount of males. So
that's true.
There
the effective population size becomes very small.
Do people just then incubate the eggs and then put them back out in the wild to try?
Well, I've modelled it. I've modelled that as a possibility and worked out how often you'd have to do that intervention for it to work. So yes, you could, but they're not doing it at the moment. Okay. I haven't touched base with my New Zealand colleagues for a few years, but I think
with turtles though, and things
Oh, yeah, we can get onto turtles. I'm doing quite a lot of work on turtle options right now, but it's not, as you say, not quite as a critical case as the tuatara, because females are generally the thing we not so unhappy about seeing. In fact, some sea turtle populations in the world are actually doing quite well, and the trend is going up. But it might well be a signal of climate change just really feminizing populations. So we're starting to see recruitment of lots of females that are kind of resulting from, I guess, consistent pulses of female production at beaches, which maybe in the past was a bit more balanced between males and female years.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but sea turtles, I guess, yeah. So extreme skews towards females is going to be unsustainable. But the main thing that is probably overrides that is just whether they'll hatch. So sea turtles don't survive in their nests. They've all across the world, sort of 30, 31 is sort of the sweet spot for getting both sexes and hatching well. As soon as you get to about 34, 35, they're very unhappy. So they may hatch very, very low hatching success, or if they do come out of the nest at those high temperatures, they're often quite malformed. They might not, be able to sort of walk in a straight line, which means they might not hit the ocean, and they'll be picked up by a gull or a crab. So if nests are just getting beyond those temperatures, they're just not hatching at all. So the sex is sort of the secondary question. It's like whether or not there's going to be recruitment.
Right. Okay.
So as the world sea turtle beaches are warming, there's a lot of people starting to apply nest cooling methods. And as we discussed before, one of those is sort of a lot of eggs are sort of actually collected in significant sea turtle populations to get them out of the way of poaching, and they put them into a little
Wait, poaching by humans or poaching by animals?
No, humans.
Okay.
So, well, a lot of people consume eggs because it's part of their cultural practice, and they need the food, they need the protein. But there's also just general. Well, I guess it is mostly poaching for food.
This is going to be a little bit controversial. Feel free not to answer, but
Okay.
Do they need the food and the protein?
Yeah.
I guess it depends which islands you're on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. Yeah, a lot of Indigenous people have always consumed sea turtles at sustainable levels, but now they're declining for a very low. There's populations in the world where only a handful of turtles now turning up to nest.
Mm-hmm.
So I've just supervised a PhD student, Anna Ortega, who's worked on East Pacific leatherbacks, and that population's close to extinction. But anyway, so in terms of cooling nests, shading's one thing. So if you are doing a conservation program, like taking eggs out of the way of a risk of poaching, you could put them into a rookery on the beach where you can put shade on as well, and then you can probably make sure they'll hatch out as some males. And then in Australia in particular, there's been a pretty big interest in trying to add water, so literally pouring seawater or fresh water onto the nest site around that time that the sex is being determined would be ideal. So that sort of pulse of cooler water, which also cools the nest for maybe a few days, could help increase survival. So I'm working on another method, which I probably won't discuss in the podcast till I've published it, but I'm going to be giving a talk about it next week. So.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a strange question.
Mm-hmm.
How much can a human intervene?
Yeah, this is what I'm talking about next week, actually.
Okay, so is this what I can't talk about?
No.
Like,
I'm going to more broadly.
Okay.
I'm going to be talking about climate adaptation strategies that we actually know would work and why we're not using them.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of it's around this sort of hesitancy about intervention and
because
risk.
there's obviously a lot of people go. What's the word? I guess study the hatchling turtles and all that, but they don't why can't they just go pick those turtles up and move them to the ocean instead of getting picked off by crabs and gulls and I can understand that's an important food source for them, and then if you're covering up the nest for them, you're essentially could be inhibiting other predators to prey.
Yeah.
And then I guess there's also the other element though of say gulls.
Yeah.
Assuming they're more Pacific gulls, not the silver gull.
And terns as well. Yeah.
But
ghost crabs in particular are particularly.
So what if there's an imbalance of the population of them, say of silver gulls?
Yeah.
They're.
Yep, could well be. They like to turn up around where humans are leaving.
Yeah, when I
food.
went up with BirdLife Australia up into Exmouth, speaking to his name's just escaped me, but he's done 30 years research up there.
Yeah,
and he spoke about saying when he first started, there was less than a few hundred silver gulls around there. And then all these other islands was where all these other seabirds were nesting and all that. And it says now no seabirds are nesting on these islands, and there's like 30 to 40,000 or more silver gulls.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
why can't, if they're picking off the turtles, why can't you just then?
Yeah. There probably will be a point where they're calling for citizen science to sort of get in there and help put things in the water. At the moment, mostly people would advise you just to let things be.
Yeah. Yeah. So
It's
why is
nature.
that? Because it's nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And obviously, it's a bit out of hand if suddenly there's a tourist industry around. People are being allowed to watch sea turtles erupt from a nest and catch them all. And, you can imagine. Yeah,
Oh, it would be
a huge.
Yeah.
I mean, and there is a bit of that sort of thing that happens in tourist sort of industries in sort of Indonesia, and there's a lot of little conservation programs that sort of make their money by allowing tourists to come in and do these sorts of things and
But they
let
shouldn't
things
be,
go in
right?
the water. Well, it depends what you think, and if it's good science behind why, then maybe that's okay, but it's all got to be approved by a certain. And in Australia, anything we do like that, it has to be sort of signed off by a government authority. So yeah, it's not something you should be doing as a private individual, but people would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how much human intervention can happen? Because that's what you were going to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a hard one. I think it's I guess one of the things I would maybe talk about a bit is this assisted colonisation, which is what I was sort of alluding to in the Tuatara case, which is one way to prevent extinction is to physically assist species to migrate to their, I guess, climate Goldilocks zone or wherever that might be, because we know climate change is happening so much faster than probably any species has been able to cope with before. And we also know that habitat connectivity is mostly lost. So they're not going to get there to where they need to be in the time frame to survive. But we could work out where that place might be, and we could introduce populations, basically. And that's what assisted colonisation is. So it's an introduction beyond the known indigenous range of a species for a conservation purpose, because you cannot mitigate the threat in its natural range. And so that came out, it was sort of an idea that was sort of someone mentioned in the 1980s, but it sort of suddenly gained prominence about 2008 when suddenly it was a big story. People were talking about, it was this time to sort of move polar bears to the southern hemisphere because they're only in the, there's going to be no habitat in the northern hemisphere. And other sort of things where, maybe this is a pragmatic step that humans could take to help species shift. And so Tuatara was an obvious example where that might be helpful. But what I've done in WA is we've been trialling assisted colonisation for one of our critically endangered freshwater turtles, the western swamp turtle. So we have done a lot of planning and the risk assessment and modelling of where we think the Goldilocks zone for this species is. And from 2016, we've done 4 trials of 2 areas on the south coast of WA, which are about 300 kilometres poleward of where we know they've ever been, and introduced them to see how they go as potential introduction sites, which is deliberately moving them there because of the perceived risk that climate change eventually will not allow them to persist in their natural habitat. So that's a big news story. So we've had that. We've had New York Times talk about that, and we had them with us, filming us a couple of years ago, and did a story as a feature because it's actually the only example in the world for a vertebrate that someone's actually done this. Lots of talking, lots of decision tools.
I would imagine.
Yeah. But
humans, we haven't
really done it yet because we haven't started an introduction, but we've been trialing it out to see what we can learn.
It's interesting, that.
And we put
purely
it in a
from
national
that
park, probably where
perspective.
some of your favourite things are. This is where we put this.
Right.
This
Okay.
species, yeah.
I wonder if I've come across them then.
Oh, you might. You better look out for them.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely talk to you after the podcast about some of these things. But
sure.
Purely from that perspective, it sounds great.
Yeah.
As humans, when we've introduced things, though,
Yes.
it hasn't been the greatest decisions.
Yes, and that's exactly why assisted colonisation it gained a lot of traction in the literature because people could argue about it. People were saying, well, maybe it's time that we've got to start doing this for certain species, and these are the certain species that might be the ones we do it for, not everything. And then, of course, anyone who was an invasion ecologist would say, no way. Because we can't predict things, and we've seen so many things go wrong. So that's why it's not, plus it's hard to, there's a lot of preparation to do anything like this that we can't, you need a lot of good science to guide a project like this. And that sort of capacity to do that for every species is limited. So we haven't really seen an open slather of assisted colonisation, but it's starting to be quite a lot of examples now.
Okay.
Um,
With other species or just in... Okay.
Other species. Yeah, butterflies in particular in Europe were sort of one of the early groups that they tried this with, shifting them towards the north, some trees in the US. But, foresters are adapting. They're moving species poleward into new areas where they need that forestry product. And agriculture's doing it. We have fundamentally transformed environments anyway.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things like, if we actually, it's a really philosophical kind of point, is like, how comfortable are we all with sort of starting to sort of accept that not all ecosystems are a thing?
Yeah,
but
well, the bit that's like kind of fascinating for me is like the last few podcasts I've done has been like parasites, and that's a huge issue with translocating or like with species, and that was like something I never thought of, because you can think of, you can basically look at the diets of these animals and if they're going to affect any of the other animals around there, and I guess some animals do switch their diets when they're translocated, but parasites was one that I never really clicked on, because if you're transferring things, and then even with plants, the microbiome, completely different. You're moving that. Yeah. I guess if you got same like Phytophthora, that was Phytophthora synonymy. Yeah. Like that, translocating that could have devastating impacts when you wouldn't.
Yeah. So you have to do risk assessment. So we've done this for the swamp turtle, because we know it's a very small species that's slow to grow. So it's not going to sort of suddenly have a booming population if it did do well, which is sort of what we wanted to do. And we also know it only eats common things like microcrustaceans and tadpoles, and none of the tadpoles come from frog species that are threatened. They're all abundant. Yep. It doesn't eat fish, and that was proven at the zoo, because these animals have been bred for release. So Perth Zoo's had a breeding program, more than 30 years old. They're doing that specifically for releasing and establishing extra populations of western swamp turtles, because it's down to about 60 animals in its final viable patch of natural habitat just north of Perth. So so we're not so the real important thing to talk about for swamp turtles is we're not suggesting the natural habitat is not worth protecting. It certainly is. There's a lot we can do to make it resilient to climate change by manipulating some of the hydrology and managing it as best we can, but we're not ever going to be moving animals from there somewhere else. We've got a purposed captive breeding program that's making basically its own purpose is to provide animals for conservation introductions. And so the zoo is sort of hatching out 60 to 70 western swamp turtles a year. So every couple of years they've got up to 200 or so ready for release, and they need to put them somewhere. And they've actually, ironically, for the first I guess areas that they started releasing them into were areas 100 kilometres north of their known range. So that's into a drier climate. So we haven't even talked about the western swamp tortoise yet, but it needs rainfall. It needs winter rains that fill swamps, because
Why do they choose up there?
Probably because the habitat looks similar to where they were near Perth, and it was done with different criteria at the time, but it wasn't really it wasn't a climatically informed decision. Now we've got the sort of science to be able to work out where that climatic area should suit them really well, and it's right down on the south coast.
I did a podcast with James Gilmore from Ames a little while ago and talked about coral restoration. Yes. And you're putting it back into the same spot where heat waves come through, so you can spend all these. Yeah, I
was with James last week. And there was a pretty interesting workshop about the future of WA coral reefs, and assisted colonisation was one of the topics.
Interesting. Okay. I'll have to get him back on, because that podcast was a little while ago.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's what James was talking about, but it was it was a conversation in the room. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one. If that, like what you were just saying, moving the swamp tortoise north into a dry, it's basically putting them to there.
They're doing quite well there, actually, ironically. But it will be
the speeds. But if they go to breed, they wouldn't.
They've reached ages where they're breeding, so it's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's more like predicting that long-term outcome. Yeah. So they need. Yeah. So this species is an unusual turtle that has I'm going to say tortoise and turtle, as I was talking to you before. It's both terrestrial and aquatic, but it needs winter rainfall that fills swamps, and that's its active period of the year. And then when the water dries, they go into aestivation, which is summer hibernation. And if they don't have that 2 phases of their life cycle every year, they don't have reproductive success. So they've got to have aestivation. So that's good. They like these seasonal systems, which is why they don't have a lot of competition with long-necked turtles, although they can co-occur. But effectively, the two freshwater turtles use a different niche. But basically, with the lower rainfall, which we've seen, a very strong signal of since about 1975, the swamps just sometimes are not very full for only a couple of months. So that means that
could be in very degraded states too.
Some of them are, yeah. So they're basically, the animals are only active then for sort of 3 or 4 months of the year rather than 6 or 7. So that means they don't grow much. They don't have much left for that reproduction buffer that the females need to make eggs. So it's a bit similar to the tuatara, that if you sort of put all those things into a population model, you can sort of project that they're just going to struggle to really ever grow a population if they're constrained by climatic factors that mean they just don't recruit very often. So you can release that constraint by putting them into an area where the waters last a lot longer and they'll have enough food every year to breed. Well, they might be too cold. So that's the thing we've been trying to work out, is how far's too far where they actually don't warm up enough to get out of bed every morning. So, there's a lot to learn. So that's what we've been doing with these trials. Is
I can imagine policy as well, right? There'd be a lot of...
Yeah. I think a really important point to make in this podcast, though, is assisted colonisation is something that a lot of people think is controversial, but Australia and New Zealand have been doing assisted colonisation for more than 100 years.
Really?
There's a nice review paper that I was involved with where we basically looked at all the translocations in Australia that were conservation motivated, where species were put into an area where they've never naturally occurred. So Australia's done it, New Zealand's done it. We've mostly put things onto offshore islands, and the reason was predators.
Yes.
And
Cats,
sometimes
foxes,
disease, sometimes in plants. So like Phytophthora you were talking about before. Sometimes plants have been moved beyond their known areas where they've ever occurred because they'll just be moving out of the way of Phytophthora. So that's assisted colonisation too. It's sort of appeared in the literature as a climate change sort of decision, but it's actually...
Wasn't the quokkas, wasn't that one?
I think Gilbert's Potteroo was put onto an offshore island in the south coast. Yeah. So anything where you're putting, for a conservation reason, into an area where it hasn't naturally occurred is assisted colonisation. So we've done this a lot. We've accepted it as a sort of good decision. It's saved a lot of Australia's mammals from extinction because we've put them onto little havens on islands where the predators can't get to, and then we've used those populations to seed them back onto islands into some of these sanctuaries, for example, that Australian Wildlife Conservancy are building across the country, putting animals that WA is sort of saved by marooning them on islands, are now restocking parts of the mainland again.
Yeah, well, we don't have two. Like we have, I guess there's a couple archipelagos.
Yeah.
But more on, say, the west coast, there's only very few amount of islands. So it's like those populations would be quite small. And they're not huge islands either. We don't have the...
No, but there are some big islands that will be great. So that, obviously Dirk Hartog's having this big Return to 1616 project where they'll have very large populations of, I think, 10 species that were locally extinct that they're returning. And once those populations are robust, and they'll be very suited for harvesting, for seeding translocations back into other parts of Australia. But you're right, lots of islands are pretty small, and the genetics of those populations isn't looking too good. So that's another area of research that I've been involved with. Which we won't discuss. Mixing mammals. Fabulous student Kate Rick, she just finished recently, but that was one of the things we were looking at.
The genetics.
Of Ireland,
Because you start getting strange morphologies, right, when they start getting too bottlenecked.
You can do, But sometimes, sometimes genetic load or sort of populations can be quite small and still be quite healthy, so you don't really know that until
but then they're quite vulnerable to a disease or something coming through.
Can be, yeah, but mixing them up again often means they regain fitness. So there's a lot of a lot of decisions around conservation translocations are whether to sort of mix populations that haven't been mixed for a very long time, as in they might have they obviously have an evolutionary history that's shared, but they may not have actually
we've created all this fragmentation through
through
land and building and all that, so I can imagine that would be quite needed to regain that connection.
But translocations, they're complex decisions to be made. There's all sorts of different reasons you do them. WA's been leading the world in translocation biology for 50 years or so, and New Zealand. We've done many more conservation translocations than any other country.
Wow.
So we know a lot about what works, what doesn't.
Yeah.
But assisted colonisation is sort of breaking a bit of new ground in the sense of doing it because of climate change.
Yeah, but then you can't put everything down in one spot, right?
No,
Either.
no. And as many people say, eventually there won't be any more habitat.
Yeah. Well, or
Yeah.
what about the species that are already on the southern limits?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's in.
Yeah.
Did you do frogs on the south coast? Or was your frogs when you
I
started?
did do some frogs on close to the south coast. Most of my frog work, I did a PhD on terrestrial breeding frogs, and I was based in Adelaide University.
What's it? Terrestrial breeding
Terrestrial breeding frogs. So Australia's got around 250 described frog species, and I think probably at least a quarter of them don't breed in water. So
Okay.
yeah.
What do their tadpoles do?
Some of them have tadpoles, so some of them have an egg that might develop on land in sort of leaf litter for maybe a month or so. Then the rains come and it floods and they hatch out, and so they have a tadpole that sort of looks like a normal tadpole to finish. But some of them have no tadpole. So I study turtle frogs, for example. They've got an entirely encapsulated egg that develops underground in Banksia woodlands.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, and my Tasmania, so I started out working on terrestrial breeders in 1994 when I was an honours student at the University of Tasmania, and a new species of frog was just discovered the year before, and I was super lucky, got to be the first person to research this thing, and it turned out to have a really strange reproduction, including terrestrial development. And it's called a moss frog because that's where its eggs are. And
right.
I luckily was there when we discovered it. They'd just found this botanist had been walking the sort of far southwest of southwest of Tassie, and hearing this ticking sort of sound in the heathlands when he was on top of mountains, and he didn't know what it was, and eventually got a frog person to have a listen, and they didn't know what it was either. So anyway, that's how the species was discovered. They'd heard this thing calling in moorlands and subalpine heathlands and under snow. But there was one site near a couple of hours from Hobart that was accessible, and that's where I did my research. And I went up there before I started my honours year, and with a government scientist, and I think we were looking around trying to work out where they were breeding, because they could find these things, but they couldn't see any water body nearby, and people thought, oh, maybe they've gone down a crayfish burrow or something. And I think we were sitting down having some lunch, and I was sitting near some patch of moss on this heath, and kind of popped these eggs up. So they basically laid their eggs inside the moss.
Oh.
And they have the largest frog egg in the world, which, as I said, takes up to 14 months to hatch. So they've got these massive big eggs.
Such a long time. So vulnerable.
They only lay 8 or so. And they all develop inside a little nest in moss or lichens or bryophytes. And they've got so normally an amphibian egg never gets big because they have no circulatory system to support the respiration of the embryo. So it's all by diffusion through the jelly. So if you have a really big fat jelly capsule, there's not much oxygen getting into the embryo. So this thing had really huge jelly capsules, and that didn't make much sense. But it does make sense when you know where they nest, because they're basically nesting in photosynthetic material that supersaturates the eggs with oxygen during the day when their metabolic demands are high, because that's when temperatures are highest. So I basically did a lot of my PhD was a lot of sort of physiological investigation of how eggs of this species work in this environment.
They have to be quite moist still too, though.
They do. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's a very moist environment, and they their little nest stays sealed inside the moss for most of that time until they come out as a little frog, more than up to 14 months later.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, my PhD was I did some frogs, alpine frogs in Tassie. I had a species I studied in South Australia where my uni was, and I had a Southwest WA study as well. Some of the threatened the Margaret River. There's 2 threatened species down there. They're called Ansticia now, but they used to be called geocrinias. So I had a study there. Yeah, and sunset frogs I had encountered in 1997 when I came across to collect another species.
They're the ones in the peatlands.
They're the ones in the peatlands that we're now working on. Yeah. And then you've got a sunset frog on your water bottle.
Yeah. Got that from Holly.
So we've got a fabulous postdoc, Emily Hoffman, who's been 3 years into
She's coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, I won't even talk about them, but...
Yeah.
Yeah. But my husband was employed at the university in 1997 to look for new sunset frog populations in the Warpel Wilderness area. And that's how we met. We met at the airport.
He did say that, actually. Yeah.
He was told to take this PhD student down to look for some eggs of this other frog, the Walpole frog. And but his main job was finding sunset frogs at night. So yeah, that's how our relationship began.
It's a very romantic frog
It
too.
is a
son.
romantic story. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But like, so I'm going to jump back to, I've forgotten the name of the frog that with the 14-month incubation.
It's called the moss frog.
The moss frog. Oh,
Yeah,
this would have been so
it was
easy to
called
remember.
Biodiversity nimbus, which means
Yeah.
moss frog rain cloud in
Okay.
Latin.
So
Yeah, it's,
when they could be quite vulnerable to like dry,
Yep.
like super vulnerable, I can imagine. To,
yeah,
like, especially dry climates, or if
all
there's like a
frogs are
drought.
super vulnerable to drying.
Yeah.
Because they don't.
Yeah.
They basically don't have much to resist, evaporative water loss either as an adult or an egg. So
Yeah.
if they're not tucked away in a moist spot where they can kind of wick up moisture, then yeah, they're going to dry out and die.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've just learned, I guess, recently is like, say, with the moss, obviously it has to be quite moist. They need
Yep.
it quite moist so that then they need moss. Moss doesn't grow back super quick
Yeah,
either.
no, not in summer.
Then a lot
Yeah.
of the burning off.
Yeah,
They burn on when we were on the BioBlitz,
Yeah.
wood out in the rocky outcrops of the moss.
yeah,
And when they did burning through that, they just burnt all like
Yeah,
prescribed
yeah.
burning.
Yeah.
I can imagine. And like, didn't Tasmania go through a drought last year or year before?
yeah. It's had quite a few, and it's had some serious alpine fires
Yeah.
through time, and particularly in the last couple of decades.
And is
There's
that
been some
frog
massive ones.
endemic to that little area?
Yeah, it's endemic to the southwest, the really remote part of Tasmania. So most of the populations have no one's really looked at them there. They just heard them. The only one that's been studied in detail is Harts Mountains, where I did my work. Yeah, so the moss up there stays pretty moist because it's sort of up in the alpine zone, but
Yeah, okay.
but it definitely got dry in some of the summers.
And then you would just lose that whole.
The nest actually sealed up, so I think it was quite cool. The jelly, so these eggs were the size of a big marble, like the conker. You know, when you have that big marble that you're playing marbles, that big one. They're about that big.
Okay.
And
That's pretty big.
when they're fully hydrated, so when
Yeah.
they're just been rain and stuff, they swell up, and then I think when they swell up, they kind of basically almost make a perfectly sealed balloon, like kind of like the jelly kind of makes a perfect circle, and then as everything dries out again, it kind of seals, and so it's like this little capsule, and the eggs develop inside this little sort of sealed cavity that's been kind of created by the jelly sort of crusting up and making this
Oh,
space.
wow.
So I think they sort of survived that quite well if that seal's not broken.
Okay.
Yeah, but if something busted it open, like a researcher like me,
Yeah.
that's maybe when they don't do
Yeah.
so well. But mostly they did fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So yeah, I was super lucky to start my career really in research by just having a new species
Yeah.
to look at, and I just did this natural history work really, and it was pretty
Oh,
special.
mate, you've done
opportunity.
so much. It's
Yeah,
like,
I've
I'm
done
sure
it.
really
I've-
just scraped the surface as
We
well.
have sort of scraped the surface, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sort of talking about more the things I've done myself, and now I have a big research group, and everyone's doing exciting things that I try and.
Yeah. Yeah. Did that reproduction of that frog though? Is there only one or two species that do that?
It's the only one that's. I mean, there's probably species all over the world that nest in vegetation, but this is the one that's got this extremely unusual nest. You know, just as I said, theoretically, frog eggs should never have big gelatinous capsules, and this one did, which made you just think, how is it doing this?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think frogs are very understudied. There's a lot to learn about
New species
reproductive
as
modes.
well?
Yeah, Australia's got some of the most incredibly interesting reproductive modes in frogs. We've got this whole lineage of ground frogs that some of them do your typical life history, which breed in water, but lots of them don't. So we've got the most famous example is the gastric brooding frogs were in this group.
Mm.
They both went extinct, and that was where the female put the eggs basically ingested the eggs, and they developed in her stomach and then hatched out through her mouth. Those two species are gone.
I worked with I would say worked with. I got a scholarship when I was in high school to go study with the Earthwatch Australia.
Yeah, okay.
And I've just forgotten his name.
Wasn't Mike Tyler? No, Earthwatch. Mike Marnie?
Oh, I reckon it was a Mike or Mike,
Yeah.
like Michael.
Yeah.
And we went out into the Blue Mountains and we were.
Yeah, hip pocket frog. You weren't talking about the hip pocket frog? Assa?
Oh, we were
No.
looking at that disease that was coming through on
Chytrid
why.
fungus, yeah.
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 And so we're out there. We were like tagging tadpoles with little fluorescents.
Oh,
and
so you're a frog person, really?
in
yeah,
heart. Well,
yeah.
that's actually a area of my PhD where I'm going back into. Hence why I was
okay.
going to speak to you.
Yes.
It is, I guess. It's at
Post-podcast.
the end of the podcast.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, probably.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that is one of the, an area that I didn't think I was going to get into, because I guess one of the things I'm going to speak to you about after, though, is when I've come across some of these water bodies.
Yeah.
There's multiple species of tadpoles and huge densities, which I'll show you some videos of.
That's
and
true.
that when I sent that to, is it Marmion, the frog lady that did the big
Oh,
book?
Marion Anstis.
Yes, she said it was like amazed by it, and I was like, oh, okay, what have I uncovered here?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And then anyway, that would be a story for another day.
Yeah.
For the
I'll
listeners.
just say that's Western swamp tortoise food, so that sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
That's what they like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good protein.
Yeah, I could imagine so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, these densities, you can like, it was more tadpoles than water.
Yeah.
Like
I've seen a few sites like that on the
Okay.
South Coast. Yeah. Particularly when there's motorbike frog tadpoles, which are pretty big
Well,
ones.
when we were
Yeah.
scooping them up in some way, there was at least 4 or 5 different species all together. Like,
that's
it was
pretty common.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Okay.
but the terrestrial ones, no, because they tend to have got specialised little spots that they breed, so there's not competition in those.
Okay. What if they're in a
locations.
salinity higher than, say, 10 to 15?
Not sure. I haven't studied that precisely, but I know
Okay.
a lot of tadpoles are quite tolerant of salinity. So some of them are breeding in pools just behind the beaches on the South Coast. And I imagine the salinity is fairly
Okay.
high.
Yeah, that's what I'm speaking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Might be the same place.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't even know if we went through many of these questions in the end.
I don't think we did.
No.
No, I think
Is it-
I think we meandered around.
Oh, it was extremely fascinating. Like, the
Yeah.
amount of work you've done is incredible, and
Yeah.
a wealth of knowledge. So I think at some stage we'll retouch again and
Talk about peatlands.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But that we did mention that's probably worth a podcast all on its
Yeah,
own.
and if you're going to talk to Emily, sunset frogs she's got some fascinating new information on those.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll make sure I'll bring that up then
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming
Pleasure,
today.
Kurt. It's been fun.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff.